Hello, my name's Julian Edgar and I'm the author of this book, Vehicle Ride and Handling, Testing, Modification and Development. What I want to cover in today's video are handling terms. How to identify what's happening with the car when you corner. Why is that important? Well, if you can't recognise what the car is doing, you can't make changes to fix it. You've really got to be able to identify if the car is doing something poor, what is it doing? And then you can make suspension changes that will actually fix that behaviour. So let's have a look at handling terms, starting with the biggest two first. Understeer. Lots of people use the word, lots of people also don't know what it means. Basically, understeer is when the car is no longer following the direction of the steering. Instead, it's going straight on. So the front is sliding wide. Now, nearly every standard factory car is set up to understeer. It's a safer handling tray than the one we'll get to in a minute, which is oversteer. With understeer, you leave the road nose first, which means if you hit something, you've got all the crumple zone in front of you. It also is safer because most people back off the throttle if a car is starting to understeer, and normally that reduces understeer. However, too much understeer is really, really bad because you don't get round corners. The car just keeps on going straight ahead. Now, understeer is typically fixed by either improving front grip or decreasing rear grip. And of course, my other videos and my book covers how to do that in a lot of detail. But remember, understeer is when the car wants to go straight on rather than following the corner. The opposite of understeer is oversteer. And that is when you turn the steering wheel, the car turns more than you've actually turned the wheel. The back is sliding outwards. Oversteer left unchecked will cause the car to spin. Oversteer means you leave the road sideways or even backwards. Backwards is all right because you've got lots of crush zone before you hit something. But if you go sideways, it's very, very dangerous because you don't have a lot of crush zone coming in from the side of the car. So oversteer is when the back is sliding out. Most drivers find it much more difficult to cope with oversteer than understeer. I know a lot of people say, oh, I love oversteer, but in the real world, it's much harder to control. And that's why car manufacturers don't set their cars up to oversteer when traction is actually lost. How do you get rid of oversteer? You typically improve the rear end grip or decrease the front end grip. And again, both techniques are covered in detail in my book. So they're the two big ones. All cars understeer or oversteer when the cornering limits are reached. I said all cars, 99.9% of cars. Some cars will go into a four-wheel drift with both the front and the rear sliding equally. But in the vast majority of cases, cars either understeer or oversteer. So that's the most basic handling tray to identify. Which of these does your car do? And then, of course, you can make changes that fix that or reduce the amount that's occurring. Power steer. Now, power steer is where the cars slide, the end of the car slides when you add more power with the throttle. If it's a front-wheel drive car, adding more throttle in cornering will normally cause power understeer, the front of the car washing wide. In a rear-wheel drive car, putting in more power on the cornering limit will normally cause the car to oversteer, power oversteer or power understeer. Now, in an all-wheel drive car, it depends very much on how the torque split is set up. A front-biased all-wheel drive car will understeer, a rear-biased all-wheel drive car will oversteer. And trickily, one that changes the torque split from the front to the back might do one or the other, depending on how that torque split is set up. And if the torque split can change as you're cornering, it might change from understeer to oversteer, for example. So power steer is where that end of the car, the end being driven with the most torque, actually slides outwards as you apply throttle. Now, nearly everyone's heard of power oversteer, drifting and so on, but I want you to get drifting out of your mind because we're talking about subtle changes in car attitude. subtle power understeer or subtle power oversteer. If you're in a high-performance road car, adjusting your cornering line with the throttle, you make only very small changes to the yaw the car is going through, probably not even discernible from outside of the car. We're not talking about lurid slides. We're talking about just adjusting the angle of the car by altering the amount of power going through those drive wheels. Power steer, power understeer, or power oversteer. Now, that leads us to the next one. And this is a really, really good way of setting up handling. And that is to use a skid pan and assess what is called the steady state understeer oversteer balance. Now, again, forget drifting. What we're talking about is a large circular layout, usually a pad, a flat area, 100 feet in diameter is often used. And you drive faster and faster, round and round and round. It's like a corner that never ends. Think of it like that. And you'll get to the point where the car is just starting to slide. It might be just understeering or just oversteering, more likely to be understeering. Then if you add a little bit of power and then back off the power, can you change that balance in that steady state cornering condition? So for example, let's talk about a front wheel drive car. You're going around the skid pan, going faster and faster. It just starts to understeer. You back off the throttle. Does it just start to oversteer? Or you're in a rear wheel drive car going around faster and faster. It just starts to understeer. If you put a bit more power on, can you just drift it a little bit into oversteer and then get off the power and come back to understeer? Now that steady state understeer oversteer balance is really, really important. In racing circles, people talk about, corner understeer on exit, corner understeer on entrance and so on. But in a road car, it's often the steady state balance that's even more important, especially when you're doing fundamental car setup. That's certainly the thing I concentrate most on getting right. Can I throttle steer it into understeer or oversteer when you're in that steady state cornering condition? Get that right, and a lot of other things will then be right as well, flowing from that. So steady state understeer oversteer balance is, think of that corner that never ends. Can I move the car from one mode to the other with power? Bump steer. Now a lot of people think that bump steer is when you go over a bump and the steering wheel jerks in your hand, but that's actually steering kickback. That's not what I'm describing. Bump steer is caused by toe changes in roll. Now, toe is the direction the wheels face. So toe in, remember, most people would know that, is when the front wheels point inwards a little bit, set up like that statically. Now, when the car rolls, if the wheel just doesn't go up and down vertically, but actually steers a bit, you're going to have steering characteristics associated with roll, and therefore steering characteristics associated with cornering. Now, this is tricky because all cars these days have bush deflections built in that cause some degree of bump steer. Normally, roll understeer. So as the car rolls, the front of the front wheels turn in a little bit on the outside. Okay, the opposite would be roll oversteer, and this is often characterized by the back wheel towing out a little bit in roll. Now, you might say, well, how do I differentiate bump steer in roll from just normal understeer and oversteer? And that's a very, very good question. Most people, you won't be able to feel it. So for a car that has roll understeer, which most cars have because of bush deflection, designed in to make the car stable, the car will just feel more stable. But if your bushes are worn, or you've got something else wrong and you have roll oversteer, you'll certainly feel it because the car doesn't feel to respond adequately to the steering. Okay? And if you have roll oversteer at really high speed, then it becomes a really spooky feeling. That's the best way I can describe it. I remember test driving a car many years ago, and it was very stable, front-wheel drive, very stable and quick and nice. And then at really high speed, like 150 kilometres an hour, 90 miles an hour, when you turn into long sweepers, you could feel something going wrong. It was just starting to steer from behind, and it was a horrible feeling. It was like someone at the back was twisting the wheels one way or the other. So bump steer, especially bump oversteer, is best characterized, I think, in a really odd, spooky, yawing feeling occurring at high speed. And typically you will only feel bump oversteer if there's something wrong with the car, but it does happen. You know, worn rear bushes on a torsion beam rear axle, things like that. I also did have another car which had bump oversteer built in from the factory, and I always just felt it couldn't be placed very accurately on the road. It just felt really wide as a car. And then, as covered in the book, we did a suspension upgrade, which included changing rear arm pivot heights and getting rid of that bump oversteer, and the car felt a yard narrower. It was just transformed in how accurately you could place it on the road, especially at speed. So bump steer is one of those more subtle, interesting, but still very, very important aspects of car handling. And here's another one that's really important. It's called roll linearity. When you enter a corner, does the car roll proportionally with how hard you're cornering? Or conversely, when you enter a corner, does the car suddenly roll and then slowly only increase in roll? Now, again, I've had cars that do that. I had a luxury car. When you turned in, it rolled sharply and you think, oh my gosh, it's not going to make the corner, and then the roll suddenly decreased. Now, non-linear roll is very disconcerting because your feedback signals from the car are starting to be lost. A car that rolls directly proportional with what's called lateral acceleration, cornering power if you like, gives you a lot of feedback because you can determine exactly what the car is doing. Non-linear roll can be caused by the car reaching the bump stops on the outer wheels, and the bump stops are a different spring rate, and so suddenly it stops leaning. It can also be caused by non-linear bush deflection, and of course it can be caused by non-linear springs. But just keep in mind that if you turn into a corner and the car rolls either very little and then starts to roll more, not likely, or rolls a lot and then suddenly slows in its degree of roll, it's very, very difficult to feel what the car is doing, and it's difficult to then place it accurately and so on. Non-linear roll is quite disconcerting in a car. Twitchiness. This is one of the big differentiators of a car set up for the track and a car set up for the road. On the track, because you know where the road goes, you know where the track goes, you know how wide every corner is, you know how sharp every corner is, there's no cars coming the other way. It's a much, in my opinion, benign environment compared with the road, where you don't know where corners go, where there's cars everywhere, where you've got a little narrow lane. On a road car, twitchiness, very fast response, is really tiring and really disconcerting. And so stuff that slows response compared with, say, a car set up for the track is typically going to work better on the road. Now, slowing response usually means not having overly high roll stiffness. A car with very high roll stiffness, springs, sway bars, dampers, is twitchy to respond. You turn and the car's suddenly turned. But it also means that if you need to have corrections, like, you know, you're being blown around in a crosswind, then it becomes twitchy. You're always chasing where you are, chasing how much lock to put on to keep the car straight. So a car which is a bit slower to respond, and that also relates to steering ratio, on a road car is much more relaxing to drive, much more less tiring. A car which is over twitchy on the road wears you out after an hour of driving. So keep in mind that you want some softness in response in a road car, or you're just going to be worn out, you know, within an hour of driving. Overly twitchy response, and I remember driving one car where when you pass trucks on single lane roads, in other words 2 lanes, but you had to go on the wrong side of the road to pass a truck, you had to hold your breath literally because your breathing was putting in steering inputs, and the steering was so twitchy, and you're right next to the truck, you actually had to concentrate like you wouldn't believe to hold the car straight. And that was actually one of the Evo Lancers, Mitsubishi Lancers. It was just so twitchy next to that truck, too twitchy, I thought, for a road car. I do like the Levo Lancers. I love a lot of their handling, incidentally, but I do remember that particular one, that particular special model was very, very twitchy in the steering, and the steering obviously relates to other aspects of the suspension like roll stiffness. So watch out for twitchy cars. You don't really want them on the road. Now, in the book, I cover a whole bunch of other handling terms as well. In this video, I'm just doing a very brief overview of some of the main ones. But in summary, what do I think good handling is on a road car? Well, firstly, it has to be controllable, and typically controllable by two aspects, the steering and the throttle. And if you have a car which can be controlled in its attitude in a corner by steering and throttle, you've got an excellent car. That's the first thing to get right, I think. You don't want a car that is uncontrollable. I guess that sounds self-evident, but a lot of people really don't set their cars up like that. Secondly, it has to be predictable. If you put your foot down, you need to know what the car is going to do. You don't want the car to always, to sometimes understeer and sometimes oversteer when you put your foot down. You always want it to do one or the other, so that becomes a mechanism of control which you understand what is going to occur. It is predictable. And thirdly, a car needs to be progressive. A car which grips, lets go and spits you into the scenery is no good. You want it to be progressive in its loss of grip, okay? Not suddenly just let go and be gone, because you won't have time to catch it. So controllable, steering and throttle. Predictable, you know what it will do when you put in a steering effort or a steering input or a throttle input. And progressive, it is progressive in its letting go behaviour and its sliding behaviour. Those things I think are key to good handling, and of course you want adequate grip. But I think that order is the order to go for. Notice how I've put grip down the bottom. Even if the car has low grip, if it's controllable, predictable and progressive, you can just have incredible fun with it and place it on the road where you want. If it doesn't have any of those but it has high grip level, I don't think much of the car. So controllable, predictable, progressive and has high grip levels. It's all covered in the book. Vehicle Ride and Handling, Testing, Modification and Development, out August 2024. If you are watching this video after that date, it will be out now. Available on Amazon in your country. Thank you.